What up, Tolkien Poppers? It is Nick here, and I have an awesome podcast episode for you where I got to talk to Andrew Nicewander, who's an awesome guy that I met at the Holy Moot Conference earlier this year in March in Charleston, South Carolina. It's very fun, very theologically nerdy. Him and I met because we have great beards, and we were also like the edgy middle school boys table at this conference. And we just got along really well. And he presented a paper at that conference called Shattered Souls and a Poignant Grief, the Hope of Eucatastrophe for the Church-Traumatized. And so Andrew's work is basically around church trauma, and particularly connecting that to Tolkien's life and his trauma. And if you didn't know, Tolkien himself had some religious trauma, which you'll get to hear about. But Andrew is a depressive castaway, loved by his wife and children, who strives to live simply and softly. In real life, he is a seemingly mild-mannered software engineer who nerds out at Imaginative Lore and loves the wild wood. But in his heart, he's an ent with a busted hip who wrestles with his maker. I feel Andrew there with the busted hip. He's recently graduated from Trinity Anglican Seminary with his MAR and written a thesis with the paragraph title of Shattered Souls and the Re-Enchanting Magic of Myth, the role that J.R.R. Tolkien and his projects of Eucatastrophe and subcreation can play in the healing of the Church-Traumatized. So kind of a longer version of the talk that he gave at Holy Moot. But I hope you enjoy this conversation. And there's not a lot of people talking about church trauma and those who've been hurt by the church and religion in general, and connecting it to Tolkien's own experience, and then how the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's writing can actually serve as a unifying point for people to find hope in, and to be inspired to create art as a form of resistance against the hopelessness of a shitty world. So I hope that you enjoy, and I will talk to y'all soon. Peace. All right, what's up, everybody? I am here with Andrew Nicewander. And by the way, this is Nick from Tolkien Pop. And we're just going to talk some really fun stuff. We're going to talk about religious trauma, which is like the best thing to talk about. We're going to talk about Tolkien, his life, his religious trauma, maybe talk about beer, maybe a little coffee, our epic beards, which if you're listening to this audiologically, you can't see, but we've got the great beards. But anyway, Andrew Nicewander, good to see you. How are you, dude?
Hey Nick, I'm doing all right, man. It's good to see you.
So for those who don't know, Andrew and I met at the conference called Holy Moot, which was organized by David Rowe, who wrote the book Proverbs of Middle Earth. Really cool guy, ordained in the Anglican Church of North America, I believe,
hmm
and just a really cool dude. And from what I can remember is that we went up to each other, probably recognizing our cool beards. And then I think we both realized that we were also kind of edgy for that group. Like people were like, I love church and Jesus and stuff. And we were like, us too, but also like we say fuck sometimes.
A little bit.
But does that sound accurate? Do I recall that correctly to a
Yeah,
certain degree?
you know what's funny with again, I don't know if it's the beard thing, I don't know if it's the religious trauma thing, but I've noticed people of that ilk tend to find each other.
Yeah.
And I know talking with you, I when we first met, I'm like, okay, I like this dude. I want to keep talking to this dude after the conference. But then I know that that actually, if I remember correctly, that's our archbishop's home cathedral.
Oh,
That
really?
church is. Yeah, that's his diocese, or that's the diocese he came out of. And so when I saw we were doing that, and I asked David, I was like, David, I want to open up with this poem. Are you okay with that? He's like, yo, okay. And you're right. the looks on people's faces were a little shocked, but it was, honesty is the best policy.
Hell yeah. And we talked about we're both like really into music, and I think I've shared my like my love for punk or whatever, but I thought that your poem was very punk in the sense of like it was
Oh,
so honest, but also like I think just genuinely shocking, but not just for shocking's sake. Like there's
yeah.
a point behind it, and I really appreciated it when I was there.
Well, it was funny. I found the book. It's really cringy. I actually used to live poem sermons at the church I grew up in,
Yeah.
and I found them. It's pretty painful. But I cut my teeth just writing a ton of really bad poetry, listening to sermons. And so when I started going to therapy, was it 12, 13, 14 years ago, I went through one and I found my way to another therapist, and she wanted to zone in on the church trauma stuff. So we were talking about it and OCD and all the rest. She's like, I want you to write a letter to the pastors. I'm like, all right. But like, I just writing a letter, it's like doing a sermon in front of a window or a speech in front of a mirror or something. Like I'm not, I can't do that. I'm just going to write a poem that I might would do at a poem slam.
Hell yeah.
So I wrote that, and I was just like, okay, let's let all this pent up frustration and anger. And with that, in like telling the story and talking about all this stuff, part of it's like, yeah, it's offensive. It still offends me. And there's a part of it that's kind of bullshit, but it was honest in terms of its expression. And I think you have to be able to sit in that distaste.
Mm,
It, it, it's like it, it's like the hearing version of something smelling really bad, right?
right.
But it's like I can smell the words and it stinks, but you still kind of have to sit in it.
Yeah.
It yeah, it kind of reminds me of that scene from Monty Python where, hey, here's some nice filth over here.
The lady in the background slamming the cat. Oh no,
Yeah,
no, that's when they're going there. That's when it's a Dennis. I didn't know you were called Dennis.
you just have to come see the violent inherent in the system, Nick.
Yeah, yeah. I'm being oppressed. I'm being oppressed. 50 year
Anyways,
anniversary as well this year for Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
is it?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. It's aged so beautifully. It still is aging like a fine wine, man. It's
Oh,
so good.
100%, dude. 100%. But, I think we had talked about this last night over text, but I think resting in the filth and in the darkness or whatever you want to call it um, is just kind of part of going through it. Tolkien kind of
Mhm.
his influence from Beowulf, Beowulf of like facing the long defeat is what Galadriel calls it in the Fellowship. And Tolkien kind of is like, yeah, life sucks and it's dark and awful, but we face it for the hope of a better, future. Um,
Yeah.
you know, and but I think before we do, I'm getting a little bit of ahead of ourselves, but before we do that, because we've done all this talk about our background, how we met, and we've hinted at some of your poetry and things, but I want you to tell us briefly about your Tolkien experience and how Tolkien, influenced your life and your engagement with the church, culture, and then pop culture, wherever you want to go with that.
Yeah, it's funny because, listening to you talk about Tolkien, different Tolkien people, David, I don't have quite the sexy, hey, I was a 10-year-old and I went to the corner store and I bought a paperback when it was just, I don't have it. I was just a little kid at a hyper Calvinist church, and I had a cousin who, and I don't know if you're listening to this, you'll have to correct me, but um, he had a Hotmail account that was like Frodo Baggins
That
at
is fantastic.
hotmail.com. But I'm wanting to say he had to go with like 1G instead of two, or was it the other way around? So he wasn't like the first one, but he was definitely the second one. And anyways, I'm like, what's Frodo Baggins? And so he's like, dude, you got to read these. And so I mean, we were kids, man. And so I found the book and I read it, and then I picked up Terry Brooks' Shannara series. I remember that being kind of the next one because I was reading a lot of like Hardy Boys, and I picked up a lot of Star Wars Legends. You
Oh
know,
wow.
respect Timothy Zahn. Okay, that whole Thrawn trilogy, just perfection. But so I was into sci-fi first, and then I picked up Lord of the Rings, read Terry Brooks, and just started reading fantasy as well. But Tolkien always had a kind of a soft spot in my heart. And then over the years, I started what ultimately led me, and we'll get into this, I'm sure. What ultimately led me to leave the church that we were in. I looked around and I call them my patron ragamuffins. They're like my own heroes of the faith. I love Rich Mullins. I look at everything going around us today, and I'm just like, I wish Rich Mullins was here to make music and to talk about this because just the South. But I love Rich Mullins, and he's one of my heroes. And so I came up with this term patron ragamuffins, and they're like my own little cloud of witnesses. And I'm looking around, and Tolkien's on the list, C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, John Newton. If anyone is OG internet blogging and remembers the internet monk Michael Spencer, rest in peace. He was one of the ones who were instrumental. She's still alive, thankfully. When Kathleen Norris does finally leave this temporal plane, she's going to join the ranks. You have to be dead, by the way, to join my patron ragamuffins. Kathleen Norris is one of my heroes, right? Um, I looked around at all these people, and none of them were Calvinist, none of them were Baptist. They were all either Catholic, Anglican, or evangelicals who tended towards that. And so I didn't really think of them in terms of specifically like, oh, here's my Anglican hero, here's my Catholic. I just like these were the kinds of Christian people that I would want to be like. And so when the wheels started falling off with the trauma and the depression and all the rest, I was like, well, they have a way of being Christian that causes them to make really good art and write really good things. And I know that they've had their own problems, but it seems like they were able to genuinely stay Christian with all this other stuff going on. Like for instance, if you want to see someone who knows how to talk to the truly postmodernism, not like postmodernism, but like after modernism, Chesterton is the best at that. Like he was seeing things when he was writing that we're just now getting into, I think. So, anyways, you look at all these people, and so for me, Tolkien is kind of alongside these other players, if you will, and just you have this person who can write these incredible stories, and like if there was a group that were Christian that we would have hated as a hyper Calvinist Reformed Baptist, it was Catholics.
Hmm.
And in particular, pre Vatican II style Catholics, which is what Tolkien was, right? But I recognized something in him. And so just over the years, I came to appreciate that. And then it was only really after I went through my own little miniature kind of deconstruction that I really leaned into really hard reading all these folks and realizing they meant a lot to me in my own faith journey and were kind of there to help keep me going. And then when it came time to work on a thesis for school, with trepidation, I went to my professor who was, coordinating it for me. Can I write about Tolkien and church trauma? He's like, yeah, like, yes, let's do it. So that's kind of I don't know if that answers the question. That's what Tolkien is meant for me.
Yeah, no, I love it. And, I think that for me, I think we, a little bit of bonding there too between the two of us is that Tolkien was very much in that transitionary point of like, what people call deconstruction popularly, but where I'm like, I don't know what I believe anymore. Is this real? Whatever. And I remember reading Lord of the Rings and like, I have no words to articulate what that experience was like, but I just remember feeling a sense of peace and calm. you know?
Mm.
And then that was kind of a big part of me going into and renegotiating my faith, and figuring out what to do from there. And so, um, what you're saying with those patron ragamuffins just feels very real because, if Thomas Merton was probably one of my
Mm.
first two, as a evangelical person going through technically I went to get a degree in religion to be a licensed minister. And like I said, it was Catholics, and mystics and stuff who really captured my attention. And then when I found out Tolkien was not just nominally Catholic, but like Catholic, it was like,
Like he
yeah,
wouldn't take communion if he didn't go to confession first, even though he needed it more than anything.
right. Well, and he was the dude who, like, when he saw like women not wearing head coverings or men wearing hats in church, he was like, golly, I don't know if I can keep going anymore. We're we're like, if this pastor, is being a total jerk and stealing money, televangelists were like, religion. But Tolkien was like, these people and their dress code, dude, I got to get out of here.
Yeah. I
Uh,
don't know how much of that was Tolkien, how much of it was Tolkien's Catholicism, and how much of it was Tolkien as an Englishman.
yeah, no doubt, no doubt. And Oxford Don, all that stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
that's true.
but we, for those of who are hearing and can put the pieces together, we're bringing up a lot of like theologians and religious figures between Andrew and I. And as part of it is, I said I went to school undergrad for religion, and then Andrew went to Trinity Anglican Seminary, right? And did his
Hmm.
MAR there and we just really we nerd out on that stuff. But I think from what you can tell from our conversation, is that we value this and it's an essential part of our lives. But obviously we've hinted at like us experience religious trauma, right? This is kind of this whole thing, and it's what you did your thesis on. But there's a lot of religious unrest, right, emerging in this cultural moment in history, and it's not new. But the technological availability of like information and the inability for many to distinguish what's real and what's not. Why do you think that Tolkien is important in addressing this like current moment in history?
So I don't, fortunately, I have it on my shelf back there. One of the, everyone thinks of Tolkien and they think Lord of the Rings,
Right.
and then maybe they think Silmarillion. Two of the most, actually, I think I do have it in this book. No, I can't remember if it's in this one or not. On Fairy Stories and Monsters and the Critics. His two well-known academic works are just, it's, for me, it's up there in terms of Western canon. And you mentioned something about, it made me think of I can't remember it exactly, but the only ones who are opposed to escape are jailers,
Yeah.
right? And there's something about fantasy there is an element of fantasy can be charged with like a cheap escapism, and I think sometimes rightfully so. What I find with Tolkien is, yeah, he defends escapism with like a capital E, but it's a fantasy world that's meant to bring color back into the one we live in. And so when I think of Tolkien, when I think of Tolkien in terms of church trauma, the two major ideas that he talks about in On Fairy Stories is subcreation and eucatastrophe. In particular, subcreation, it's intimately involved with material reality and our human responsibility in the context of that. So, yes, he's writing about Middle Earth, and I know there's a conceit about it's like some previous age that we're like it's talking about what was it, the third and the fourth age, and we're like in the seventh or eighth or something, according to
Right.
the. That's neither here or there. In my mind, he's thinking through and processing through his own experiences and where they were at in England when he was alive, and he's telling this story through Middle Earth. It's incredibly. Verlyn Flieger, I think that's how you pronounce her name. She's really good on this. It's yeah, there's magic, but it's never like magic for magic's sake.
Yeah.
And honestly, the power of the ring isn't so much the magic of the ring. It's the lust for power that's inherent in Melkor slash Morgoth slash Sauron slash the Maiar slash all of them have this temptation. And that's where the real power of the ring comes from. So I look at Tolkien and like he's concerned with that materiality, but it's also a materiality that like you said, he recognizes the reality of the long defeat. I know he put those words in Galadriel's mouth, which is fascinating. He says it in his letters in at least 2 or 3 different spots that I can think of. What I love about that northern sense that he has is, yeah, you know what? Life's really crappy sometimes. And so he lost his father as a very small child, lost his mother as an early teen. He loses all of his high school buddies, all but one, in war. Saw people dying left and right. I mean, the dead marshes are based on the Battle of the Somme. He said that explicitly. And then what he saw his mother go through as a young man, and we can talk later about this, about the religious trauma aspect of that. He knew a lot of crappy things that happened. And even if you want to look later on at the Inklings, the falling out that he and Lewis had weighed on him. And you can see it when he talks about when Lewis died, how sad he was, and then losing his wife before he died. Just the man had sorrow after sorrow after sorrow. And a lot of men of his generation gave up and they gave themselves over to hopelessness. What I find fascinating about Tolkien is he didn't. And because he could stare into the face of this hopelessness and say, yeah, but the hope of hope. There's a hope of Eucatastrophe, and I'm not giving that up, right? So, like we talked about, Tolkien is Catholic. He says that, I can't remember what, you'll remember the letter probably, where it's the work is explicitly Christian, especially in the revision, but it's not explicitly explicit. It's like an implicit explicitality. It runs throughout, but he's never in your face about it. There's like 2 instances that I can think of where there's religious rituals. One of them actually is Sauron in Numenor with human sacrifice, and then there's the scene in the glittering, not the glittering cave. Anyways, Faramir and his men, the Dunedain of the south, they stand up before dinner and look to the west, looking towards Numenor and Eärendil beyond it. That's the only religion you see in the story. So it's not explicitly Christian, but it's Christian insofar as for him, he said that Eucatastrophe, that the incarnation is the Eucatastrophe of human history, and then the resurrection is the Eucatastrophe of the incarnation. Insofar as the gospel is Eucatastrophe, that hope rings true for him, and it rings true in the story. And it's interesting too that in that something as explicitly Christian as the incarnation of Jesus does a ridiculous amount of work in his telling to undergird that idea. And so, anyways, I look at Tolkien, and this is an English Catholic who is a pre-Vatican II style Catholic who's a medievalist and hangs out with a bunch of other medievalists trying to support the Western project, but he's very much a modern man. And I think really he, like Chesterton, was a postmodern man as well, because there's something about him and the stories he tells that continues to speak to people like you and me, but also our friends who've been traumatized by Christianity and have left the faith completely.
Yeah.
They could be pagan, they could be agnostic, they could be wildly atheistic, and they still find something in Tolkien and will defend Tolkien against his detractors.
Yeah.
Even though, in terms of his beliefs, he's about as different as they are now as could be, right? There's something powerful about that I think Tolkien can still speak about. The other thing, I did have another thought. The other thought is I always go back to the scene when Samwise and Frodo are in Mordor.
Yeah.
And the clouds, the Maiar or the Valar have, basically the winds of what's the head? I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. What's the head Valar's name?
Manwë.
Monway's winds, right? It comes out of the west
Hmm.
and it starts pushing the clouds out of the way of Mordor. And Sam sees the star
Yeah.
and it pierces him. There's a beauty that pierces him. And I think what Tolkien is talking to is there is a celestial hope beyond the Mordor clouds of our modernistic consumerism and I would argue also our transhumanistic Gnosticism.
Mm.
This idea that treats materiality as this gross thing, like we have to put the skin on. He speaks against that as well, and there's a beauty beyond all of that that he's pointing out, even as this raging tradcath. And I like to think he's raging internally.
Yeah, yeah. He seems to be, I think people say you because we have access to his personal writings that a lot of people don't
Yeah,
have access to.
yeah.
I think I remember reading too about, just connecting with C.S. Lewis about how
Right here,
there it is. Ooh, the new edition. Let's go,
a new
baby.
edition.
Let's
Yeah,
But, I think I didn't know this, but I know Holly Ordway's new book, Tolkien's Faith, she brings it up, and he's got it right there. It's a great
yeah,
biography, but she talks about like C.S. Lewis's own discriminatory comments about Roman Catholics during the Spanish
yeah,
Civil War. And it seems like Tolkien kind of kept it close to the chest and didn't really speak about it very angrily. He might have, I think she mentioned that he kind of was like, "What the heck's your problem?" But that was kind of the extent of it, and was part of why they had a falling out. But
yeah,
like you were talking about this, and I wonder brought that point up just to talk about like the religious sadness and trauma kept going for Tolkien even after his mom and his family experienced discrimination. And so, 2 points of what you said to just kind of give people context is that in Tolkien's life, his mom's side was Baptist and his dad's side was Anglican. And so he was born in the Anglican church, was baptized in the Anglican church. And once his dad died, his mom's family took him in. And back then, in the early 20th century, particularly in England as well, but around probably in other places, the US and Canada, Protestant and Catholics did not get along. And there was it was almost racialized to the point where if you were a Catholic in a Protestant neighborhood, you could not get a job, you were poor, and essentially that was reversed as well in other places in the world. But Tolkien's family, or Tolkien's mom's family, found out that she had converted to Catholicism, said, "Hey, stop that, or we're going to cut you off." She didn't. They cut her off. And Tolkien blamed, so she died of diabetes, and Tolkien blames her death on that side of the family and against religious discrimination. So, and Tolkien continued to experience religious discrimination, even amongst from his best one of his best friends, C.S. Lewis. But all that to kind of bring this to with Eucatastrophe is that for those who aren't familiar, Eucatastrophe is this term that Tolkien invented that brings together the 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 prefix euca, right, the good, right, and then the catastrophe of the suffix there, um, the good, the good catastrophe essentially. And so Tolkien's kind of saying like, hey, amidst the darkness, right? And he connects it explicitly to the incarnation, as you said, is that Jesus had to die in order to resurrect. And not getting into weird stuff that like God killed him or anything that theologically. I'm more making a statement of like, in order for it to be a good story and to have a happy ending, we have to feel sadness. And Tolkien recognized this in his own life where, you know, the darkness is there, but in order for me to come out of it and emerge a new person, a hopeful person, um, there has to be a happy ending. In order for their happy ending, there has to be a sad ending, which is really interesting. And I don't think that perspective, like that hope, is present in current religious trauma conversations. I think it's one extreme or the other. It is either one, you experienced it, God has a plan, get over it, right? Stay in church if you doubt, if you're going to hell, right? Or the other extreme, which is this is all bullshit, reject it, and get out of there. And I think from our experience and people we know, like both responses are understandable, right? But this kind of other alternative of like, let's renegotiate what's going on. How do we handle this? This thing. And so I guess the next part of this conversation and question is like many Christians and former Christians have expressed, right, a disappointment or complete disinterest in the various churches throughout the U.S. and other parts of the world. And many times these responses are induced by this church trauma, as we've talked about. Um, so interestingly, like in your work, why we're here, as you've pointed out, that Tolkien also went through this religious trauma, and would you mind sharing your story with about your church trauma and unpacking like Tolkien's church trauma a little bit more and connecting that to your own story?
Yeah, so I grew up in a church that was explicitly Reformed Baptist. It that tradition kind of comes out of um, there's an American Puritan aspect to it, a little bit. There's an English Puritan aspect to it. There's connection with Calvinistic. What's their word? Anyways, Congregationalist. But ultimately, their confession, the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, came out of the Act of Toleration and basically flowed theologically forth from the Westminster Confession, the classic Presbyterian confession that came out of the Westminster Assembly around the time of the English Civil War. So there's a lot of political and cultural stuff related to how they got going. There's kind of two groups that tradition feels very negatively towards, and it tends to be the Church of England and Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholics, through the infamous statement of the Pope as Antichrist, that made its way into the Baptist confession, but also the experience by Calvinistic Baptists at the hands of the Church of England, both, when it was in Puritan hands, but also, prior to that and prior to the Civil War and Cromwell and all the rest. And so that's kind of the background of the tradition I grew up in. And over the years, it started becoming more and more authoritarian, much more explicitly confessional, to the point of it's no longer what does the Bible say, it's what does the confession say about what the Bible says is the overarching question. And it started getting elements of cultishness. I grew up there from the time I was 9 months old or something like that, 8 or 9 months old, till I was 29 when we left. And I have friends who were there then who have said it was a cult. I don't know that I agree that it was a capital C cult, but it was definitely cultish. I've heard stories, people who've left, and like I even have some people I can think of who were still there, younger men 15 years after me, who experienced the same kind of stuff. And at the time, it's like something doesn't feel right, but you don't know. That's what you're used to. Something said I got to leave. So we finally left, and I started experiencing a lot of sadness. And my physician, my general practitioner physician's like, I think you're depressed. Let's try this very low dose med, see if that has any effect. It didn't. All right. I got therapists I want you to see. So I talked to her. Within 20 minutes of our conversation, she's like, tell me about this church. So we talk. I do therapy with her. I move on to a second therapist. I've had 3 different therapists over the years. And anyways, what ended up coming out was that there was something like spiritual abuse. Now, I don't have any explicit stories of this particular thing happened to me. Some of my friends do. All I know is the effects of 30 years of hyper-Calvinism, authoritarianism, this really myopic brand of Christianity has an effect. It gets at you. So The closest I've seen in some of the literature, there's two things. There's religious trauma syndrome, which some of the people who write about it, they kind of have their own axes to grind. And so there's some things you have to kind of sort through. There's some other stuff I've seen related to complex post-traumatic stress disorder that's really like a kind of PTSD that comes out of emotional abuse, usually at the hands of parents. Couple those together, that's about the closest I can get to the effects of 3 decades worth of that on the psyche of a sensitive child. A lot of my friends from back when I was there have either expressed similar things or have started to as they're processing it. And it can take decades sometimes to come to that point. And so what's really nasty about it is like the stories of things that you've seen, like for instance, Western Pennsylvania had a really nasty decades long worth of systemic abuse by the Catholic Church in that part of the state sometimes. So that's kind of my experience with that. And it's just, 30 years of that takes an effect on this, has an effect on the soul. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. And it's funny, there's evidence of OCD in the family and depression elsewhere in the family. I got hit with all of it.
Yeah.
You add some other stuff on top and it just kind of exacerbates it, right? One thing that's interesting when you read the literature in OCD, a lot of it actually starts coming out with trauma-induced OCD. The OCD was always there. The trauma affords you the ability or the opportunity for those compulsive behaviors to start getting in the way, which causes more obsessions, which causes more compulsions, and that's your death spiral. And
Right.
and when I say death spiral, I really do mean death spiral. Suicide is a real concern. If talking about the muck of this stuff, right? So when you look at something like church trauma, it's not just what Driscoll has recently said, people who don't want to hear the truth. These are people who actually are at risk for major depression and the self-harm that comes from it. But they're not a part of the church anymore, so we wipe our hands like Pilate and we go along our merry way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, just especially the kind of like the frog in the boiling pot is
Mm-hmm.
that, and I think people who have experienced abuse and trauma, like when you were talking about that, I knew exactly what you were talking about. Right. And it doesn't have to be somebody doing something explicit, as you said, right? The implicit, slow development of abuse, whether it's emotional or spiritual or both, is something that affects the mind and the physical body, right? It's something that is
Oh
real,
yeah,
and the compulsions you were talking about begin as coping mechanisms, and then when it becomes too much to cope, right, there's the risk of life. And the when it comes to OCD, right, all these other kind of like anxiety, ADHD, depression, most times when people have one, especially those three, it's at least two and probably all three to varying levels,
yeah,
right?
yeah. I
Um,
do. I have all three.
yeah, I think I don't know if anxiety is probably on the lowest, but I take a depression med that also deals with the ADHD. Um, just because we've talked before, and I had experienced implicit as well as the explicit abuse from a pastor, and um, just connecting that to Tolkien, where even though he didn't experience that type of thing, like I guess within the church, he was still subject to a spiritual abuse from it was connected to, it was a personal connection where generally these things that are supposed to be life-giving was literally life-taking, you know?
Yeah,
And he was able to find something religiously to go into, and he had a church family, right, with Father Francis Morgan and the oratory and all of that whole that close knit relation, but a lot of people don't have that. But I don't know. So based on what work you've done and kind of you sharing your experience with that and the effect of the mind, like why do you like how do you connect that to Tolkien, and how is it like how do we see his example in his life as something that can help us, um, us as individuals who are victims, but also maybe also there's people who are lay people who are committed still, and then also pastors and leaders who um, are not abusers who have the ability to bring healing and care, right? Um, yeah, and I guess too, I don't want to disclose. There's people who are not in the church anymore, and that's valid, right? And so I
Yeah.
guess even for them too.
Well, there's a lot of thoughts here. I'll start with one thing, and that is Lewis in multiple places works on this idea. I think the best expression is in his reflection on the. He's actually talked about the imprecatory Psalms, but in his book Reflections on the Psalms, he talks about and his zinger is of all bad men, religious bad men are the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And he says it gives new meaning to our Lord's words to count the cost. Now, he's ironically enough a good churchman of the Church of England,
Right.
who's had his fair share in its history of that, right? With the backing of the monarch, right? And he says that now. Earlier on, he's talking about how that's why he's not a theocrat, okay? But he also says that any belief that has the force of religion, you don't have to be religious to have that. If you look at his space trilogy, it's that third book. It's not religious leaders who are the baddies. It's basically bureaucrats who come at things with the force of religion. And if you want to see that force of religion, just look at the political world around us and everything that's going on. Now, we as Christians actually have a monotheistic religion, so we're in particular susceptible at this. So that's part of it. Another part of it, I think, with Tolkien, so like he loses his dad, and I can't remember one of the that's maybe underappreciated because everyone focuses on his mom, on
Right.
Mabel, and I mean, look at Gandalf. He is basically almost a perfect father figure, kind of to Bilbo, definitely to Aragorn, definitely to Faramir, and definitely to Frodo. So he loses his dad. His mom is left. He's a sensitive kid who's playing in his head with languages. She dies. Okay. Now she dies from complications and in pain related to her inability to have medications she needs because they're basically dirt poor. Because she was wanting to become Catholic, she was encouraging her sister to become Catholic with her, which caused Arthur to get pissed off, which caused him to take the money away. You mentioned all this. One thing that struck me reading through his letters is how often he talks about his finances. That's the sign. He goes on and on about his finances, even when he's making bank off Lord of the Rings. He's still stressed out about it, and he still doesn't spend a lot of money. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of my grandmothers who had experience with the Great Depression,
Right.
who had serious need. That need didn't have to be there. It was there because his mother's funds were cut off because she'd become Catholic. He calls her a martyr, and he says she was persecuted. She was not persecuted politically. She was persecuted by her in-laws.
Right.
And oh, by the way, you want to talk about the background of politics? They were all Germans. So the whole Protestant versus Catholic thing had that undercurrent going on as well, right?
Yeah.
Tolkien is a German name. And so, anyways, he talks about that. She converts to Catholicism, puts him into poverty. It led to an exacerbation of her stuff. Anyways, he's still talking about it 60 years later. There's a letter that was written like a month before his own wife dies, where he's still talking about how impactful that was. Like it's insane how deeply it affected him. What was it? I have a quote here. Ordway calls it an occasion of serious religious significance for Tolkien, which
Mm.
is, I think, she understates it. She severely, in my mind, she severely understates how impactful that was. But be that as it were, he's an Englishman who is Catholic. And like I talked about, he has a letter. It's I there's no time to read it. It's spectacular. A letter he wrote to Michael, letter 250. And that's the one, by the way, one of my favorite Tolkien lines comes from this letter where he says, there is a truth that's hidden out of the reach of cynicism. Now that's in the context of Oxford Dons.
Yeah.
But he goes from that and talking about how I've had my share of bad priests. I've seen problems with the church. Yeah, it's frustrating when there's women who don't have their heads covered and there's children who don't know how to behave themselves, but that's the way the church needs to be, right? He goes into this whole discursus about it, and he ultimately encourages his son to. He said, "Please don't leave the faith. Your grandmother gave her life for it, and the thing that's going to be most impactful, most meaningful for you is communion." Now that speaks to my soul because I had a really bad baptism experience. I still don't like to think about my baptism. People say, "Hey, here's your baptism." Someone's getting baptized. Use this. Remember your own baptism. Like, I prefer not to. It's one of my most traumatic memories. I don't want to think about my baptism. When I walk into our sanctuary, there's a little baptismal. I force myself to put my fingers and cross myself to feel the water on my fingertips to remember, right? So communion for me is very impactful. Like, I don't listen to sermons if I can help it. Sorry, Bub and Charles, Bub and Chris, I don't like sermons. I don't know if they're going to listen to this. I'm losing myself. I don't like sermons. Communion means a lot. And so like Tolkien would miss communion. The one thing that kept him from being almost suicidal was communion. But he was so devoted to his mother's memory and her faith and what was his faith that he would not go to communion without confession. And if he had to miss confession, he would force himself to miss communion, although it was the very thing he needed. So all that to say, his Catholicism wasn't this triumphalistic thing, which unfortunately you see with a lot of Catholic writers with Tolkien. It was survival. It was survival for Tolkien. So like you look at the ex-Catholics who've been traumatized by the Catholic Church and like, I do not want communion. I don't want to see another collared priest. I'm as far away from that crap as I can get. But for Tolkien as an Englishman in that era, that was his. And so like the one guy who actually was a real father figure, Father Murray, if I remember correctly. He was a Catholic at the oratory that Cardinal Newman was a member of.
He was an assistant to Newman too. Yeah.
Yes. Like if you want to talk about ground zero for English Catholicism, Tolkien kept his faith because of it. Because of these Catholics actually welcomed him and were loved. I mean, what was it? There was in that letter to Michael, he talks about one thing that was really meaningful is his mother got the same size of tomb. I didn't realize this when I was reading this last night. She got the same kind of tombstone that Newman got.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Like when they buried her with as much honor as their leading members of this community ever got.
And as a woman back then, that was not normal.
And that meant a ton to Tolkien decades later.
Mm-hmm.
He's still talking about it. So I'm like, I really get into this. I think now there is something that, and I don't know if this is where you want to get into this or not. Was it letter 329 where Tolkien talks about the dangers of psychologizing a writer?
I'm not sure. So you unpack that for us.
Sorry, I'm gonna pull this letter up because it's really worth reading.
Yeah.
Bear with me. I do have the letters, but I don't have it bookmarked. This one actually was written towards the end of his life too. Where is it? Following points. One of my strongest opinions is that investigation of an author's biography or such other glimpses of his personality as can be gleaned by the curious is an entirely vain and false approach to his works, and especially to a work of narrative art of which the object aimed at by the author was to be enjoyed as such, as literary pleasure. He later says something key. Okay, very fascinating. He says, when they have read it, some readers will, I suppose, wish to criticize it and even to analyze it. And if that is their mentality, they are, of course, at liberty to do these things so long as they have first read it with attention throughout. He's talking about Lord of the Rings and all the rest of his stuff. Not that this attitude of mine has my sympathy, as should be clearly perceived in Volume 1, page 272, Gandalf. He that breaks a thing to find out what it is, has left the path of wisdom, which is what Saruman did, which is one of the things that he had a beef with Lewis at, because Lewis basically said, hey, yo, screw tape letters, that's in honor of my friend Tollers. I can't remember if he said that there. Tolkien was angry about that because he thought he was delving too deeply into the arts of the enemy, which is that same impulse. Now, sorry, I get excited about this.
Oh, did go for
This
it.
leads me to another profound. This is why Tolkien means so much to me. In Monsters and the Critics, which I have it right here, must read, anyone listening. He talks about the and actually, can I read this as well, please?
Dude, yes, please. Yes, please.
This, the man wrote two allegories that I know of that are meaningful. He hated the genre. And then he goes and writes Leap by Niggle, okay? And he writes this very short allegory in the middle of this brilliant takedown of basically modernistic academia. He says, I would express the whole industry in yet another allegory. And I say this because the whole publishing industry around Tolkien is susceptible to this, by the way.
Yeah, no doubt.
A man inherited a field in which there was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in the building of the house which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. But his friends coming perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it, and forgot even the stones. They all said, this tower is most interesting. But they also said, after pushing it over, what a muddle it is in. And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, he is such an odd fellow. Imagine he's using these old stones just to build the nonsensical tower. Why did he restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion. And, oh, here's the best part. But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. There was something else that he intended. And you go tearing the tower down, you try to explore it for its constituent parts, you're going to miss the whole freaking point of the whole thing. Now, Tolkien talks about a nightmare he had about a sea, right? He'd had it ever since he was a young man. I can't remember which of his sons got the dream.
It was Christopher.
Is it Christopher?
I think so.
He bequeaths it to Faramir, of all people, which actually is the character that he resonated the most with. Of basically an Atlantean type of tsunami that came to destroy. Okay. So he has this nightmare that was so impactful to him that he wrote it into the character that he resonated the most with. Actually, one of the best characters of the whole series, right?
Oh, yeah.
And this is what's so meaningful. He took this bad thing, this nightmare, he faced it directly, and he turned it in so many beautiful ways. So he talks about this tower being to see the sea, this beautiful thing that was also the source of destruction. The elves, as soon as they hear the gulls, they're lost. They want to leave Middle Earth and go back to Valinor out of love for the sea. More powerful to me, though, and I don't have it with me, the Sea Bell poem.
Yeah.
At the end of the Tolkien Reader, there's the conceit about the whole Red Book being a Hobbit work, and so the Silmarillion is an Elvish work, the Lord of the Rings is a Hobbit work, and there's this little quote unquote side note, right? That's like Frodo's dream. He says, and I can't remember which letter, that Frodo ultimately failed, and that Frodo's journey to Valinor was akin to purgatory. that most likely Bilbo died on the journey. Frodo gets to Valinor and perishes himself. It's not an undying land for a hobbit. He
Right.
still has to die, right? And he had got the wound on Weathertype. It was devastating, and it was a trauma that he had to relive every year, right? So you have this horrific poem called The Sea Bell. He travels and it's empty, and the woods are dead, and he comes back and it's empty. It's just this hopeless existence. And it's at the very end of the Tolkien reader. And it's like, is this what happens to Frodo? Maybe, maybe not. At least according to later Hobbit scholars, maybe so. So you also have this idea of the sea. You build this tower to see the sea, but you also have the sea as this mechanism for purgatory as well. And you know what it got me thinking of? It got me thinking of, for whom doth the bell toll? It tolls for thee. Nick, for whom doth the sea bell toll? Right? I'm giving
Yeah.
myself boot simple, bro. So all that to say, I am in particular danger of psychologizing Tolkien and trying to break up his work into its constituent parts to study it. But by the same token, I don't think Tolkien, I think there's too much of the modern Englishman in Tolkien here. I think he's right in the danger, but there's a reason the work was a Catholic work, right? And it's because he was a Catholic man. And why was he a Catholic man? Because of what he went through and what his mother experienced. He freaking wrote her as like the most amazing elvish. That's her. You know, Galadriel points to her. It's a Marian moment. He thought of his mother. There was a reason he was devoted to Mary like he was.
Oh yeah.
And it was because of his devotion to his mother as a good Catholic. So I don't know. How do I tie all that together? I look at Tolkien, and he was a man who, he could have ditched the faith like so many men of his generation did. So like I looked at it for myself. Like I could have accepted what the Reformed Baptist taught me is true and gone back. I could have accepted what they said is true insofar as this is what Christianity is and rejected it. Or have been like, you know what? Maybe there's something above and beyond the mortal reaches of Reformed Baptist hyper Calvinism, the mortar clouds, right? Something beyond the mortar clouds of this crap. And I think that's what Tolkien ended up doing. And so he developed the language, he developed the story to tell the language, and then he realized, wait a second, there's some bigger things going on. I'm subcreating. There's a theological thing that I'm doing here, and I think it's a good thing. And then he's like, oh, hey, look, there's this Eucatastrophe that showed up. That's kind of like what happens in the incarnation. And so I look at that and I'm like, there's a line from 21 Pilots. Tyler Joseph wrote it when he writes about kitchen sink. And he talks about, a kitchen sink for you is not a kitchen sink for me. Okay, friend. If you're struggling, then find purpose in making. Write something that it might be worthless. Paint something that it might be worthless. Pointless curses, nonsense verses. You'll see purpose start to surface. And then he says, no one else is dealing with your demons, meaning maybe defeating them can be the beginning of your meaning, friend. Tyler Joseph gets what Tolkien got, and that it's this subcreative impulse. I'm not going to say it's our salvation, but it can lead to that. And it's this, I refuse to give up to the, pardon everyone for this, the fucking hopelessness of our generation. There is a truth out of the cloying reaches of our cynicism. And I shitpost as much as anyone else. I'm as susceptible to the cynical internet culture crap as anybody, but there's truth beyond the reaches of that. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm preaching, Nick.
No, this is fantastic,
I
dude.
don't
Like,
making sermons.
no, dude, this is like the thing that I think that even people who are not people of faith, I think can resonate with what you said. And I don't want to like take more and kind of build on what you said, because what you said was so amazing, and your delivery was so was so just meaningful and powerful. But like you said, there's this salvific, if you want to call it that. But even if not, for people who are like that language means nothing to me. Like you said, there's this tension that happens, right, with the sea bell, with Earendel, the star, right, which Earendel is an Old English poem about Christ, right? And so this tension of both life and death being held together, and a lot of times sometimes we do desire death, right? And a lot of time, and this tension between wanting life and death, but kind of transcending this, right, through, for Tolkien, right, it's the resurrection, right, it's the hope in Christ in that work. But it's expressed through subcreation, as you talked about, and people who are beyond that can find, for at least for me anyway, when I see this, when I tell people and I connect with people who are atheists, agnostics, or pagans, that they're like, yeah, the reason why I keep coming back to Tolkien is that subcreative impulse, that hope, and that even in the darkness, right, this grasp for human meaning. Um, I'm trying to even think, friendship, fellowship, Sam marrying Rosie, right? Merry and Pippin being buried with Aragorn, right? Like Arwen's like, you know what, I'm going to die, but I'm going to hang out with Aragorn, even if he goes. Um, and that, like I said, like you're taught, the goosebumps are real. Like the tears,
Yeah.
the emotions is overwhelming.
And talking about those two, that's just a recapitulation of Beren and Luthien, which
Yeah.
is another character from the Legendarium that Tolkien and his wife he associated them with. And so the whole story of Aragorn and Arwen is basically that fleshed out is in the Third Age. And there's something else you got me thinking about. There's he talks about how the tower had been an old meat hall, right?
Yeah.
And he talked about basically I think he might have used the language of like a soup, which is I have my own way of thinking through that in terms of my own mental health. But anyways, he talks about I think it's the soup, the language he uses, where everything that you write is is owed what comes before. And then
Right.
I mentioned Shannara. Terry Brooks owes that whole story to Tolkien. Sometimes weirdly explicitly so, like, dude, do something new. But um the two kinds of people that I can think of that you don't really see a whole lot of about. He borrowed the idea of the Hobbit elsewhere, but the hobbits and Ents, right? Those are kind of two explicitly Tolkien things. And as I'm thinking through this, and I'm gonna try to talk. I haven't thought of it this way before. Who's the one guy who was the worst at trying to break things up in their constituent parts to understand it and gain mastery? It was the wizard who should have known better, Saruman. If there's anybody who's a modern day Elon Musk in the Lord of the Rings, it's Saruman,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
is Middle Earth technocrat, right? And he's all about machines and machinations and power and control. And again, a wizard should have known better. Who are the two people who take him out? It's the Ents and the Hobbits through Wormtongue. But the Ents and the Hobbits are the ones who deal with him. And so I think Tolkien has taken that and he's like, hey, yo, guess what? The two groups of people who maybe are like closest and dearest to my heart as an Englishman, they're the ones who take this mofo out.
Yeah, dude.
And so part of it is the Ents, they get upset, they get positively hasty, and nature gets its revenge. But then he takes that evil and he destroys the countryside, and they have to scour it and they have to cleanse it. And now the Malorn tree that Galadriel gave, and Samwise, the hero of the story, do all that. But you have the hobbits, they go through all of this so that now they're grown up enough to take care of Saruman on their own. And they do. Now, there's kind of another Eucatastrophe that's bad for Saruman, good for everyone, and that's Wormtongue. um, but be that as it may, it strikes me that these he writes into the story these two people that are basically his own creations are the ones who take out this guy. And see, that's the thing too, is I think that, again, at the risk of psychologizing him, I think that's him processing his trauma. I really do. I think he said the story was given to me, and that's true, but he was working through shit. And
Yeah.
it wasn't just the religious trauma. I don't want to overemphasize it. It was a small part of what his trauma. The war. You look at the statistics for the Battle of the Somme. I don't know if there's a reason it's called the Great War. And these were all Christian countries doing it to each other. Like, this is Christendom's death blow, right? And he experienced that firsthand in France. He actually did charge the front line at one point and got trench fever and had to be sent back. And that's how he survived when all his buddies died. So he saw, and the reason he can write the Dead Marshes like he did is because he saw what that looked like. And he saw what machines can do at the hands of evil men. So I think a lot of it, what he's doing, again, at the risk of psychologizing, he's processing his trauma. So I look at the people who've gone through it, and I'm like, I understand why you're not a Christian anymore, and I don't blame you. I really don't. I used to, I don't anymore. But can I encourage you to at least don't give up hope, and to look at this old Catholic Oxford Dawn as an example of how not to do that? And go paint things and write things that might be worthless, but it's still valuable to help you defeat your demons, you know?
Dude, yes. I think that is a great way to end this conversation right now, is that even amidst the differences, like Tolkien's that dude where we come together, and hopefully it restokes our hope and creativity. So but maybe part two will come in and unpack some more, hopefully. But so we'll end there. But before we go, is there any final words that you want to say? And is there anywhere that people can find you on the internet or find your work, that they can go and check you out if they're interested?
Yeah, Substack is probably, that's where I'm trying to do my latest writing. Sorry, I'm pulling up. I do want to read one more thing that says what I want to say the best. So I'm going to try to, I don't do two things very well at all. But Substack, which is, I guess it's the Wandering Gale.substack.com. I think I have links on that too. I have a Twitter, but I don't barely use it. You can find my name on Facebook if you want a bunch of silly Vance memes.
They're amazing. It's amazing.
And now the government's going to keep me from getting back into country if I ever leave.
Maybe not if you say please.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's it. That's the main thing. Sorry, I'm distracting myself. I'm trying to find. Oh, here it is. Okay. Can I read this?
Yes, please.
I'm not going to read the whole thing. Okay, here we go. So this is part of my. Anyone can find this by just Googling it. It's called Elegy of a Castaway. Okay. So this is kind of a journey through processing through church trauma and going through a rageful deconstruction. And this part of the poem is kind of where my mind was as I tried to turn away from it. Okay. Now I turn from systems and doctrines and damnable love of sacred texts that cloud my eyes and minds. I turn from legalistic psychoses that force my God-given unity through man-made shit-filled human uniformity. I turn from damned authorities that fuck love children through guilt and hateful, selfish spiritual abuse. And I turn from worshiping a deity who watches in proud solemnity as rebels burn. If there's a God who seeks to sing some holy fucking wrath, he's dead to me. So here I cry, a weeping orphan corpse who hopes within his mad dubiety that there is love within the shattered world. That God is not a pastor writ large who's bent on beating me shitless with shame and laws and lies disguised as fundamental truths. That maybe this world has meaning, and that maybe I'm liked and loved for who I am and not for who I'm it to be. That though I wonder, I'm not yet lost, I hope. beyond the reaches of the reckless raging fury that's been called the love of God. So that's the hope, man.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time, man. It's been fun hanging out, and
absolutely.
just and you know, and talking Tolkien and all and religious trauma and hope and creativity. So, yeah, I'll connect people. I'll add links to your stuff, and then we'll let's hang out soon.
Awesome, man. Good talking.
Yeah, dude.